Hello, my name is Michele Byers, and I'm the chair of the Salt Spring Forum, a small community charity on Salt Spring Island that brings interesting and influential people to our island for discussions about the great issues of our day. None of these issues is more important than the issue of climate change. And this evening, I'm very pleased to be introducing you to Professor Michele Koppes from the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia, who is a world-leading expert on glaciers and the effects that climate change on glaciers are having to our landscapes around the world. You'll find it's an enormously engaging discussion. She is being interviewed by Katharine Byers, who is a teacher here on Salt Spring, who also happens to have a master's degree in geography from Oxford. So without further ado, I give you Michele and Katharine. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele, for joining us here with the Salt Spring Forum. Welcome to Salt Spring Island, virtually. And I'm really excited that you've got a lot to share with us today with regards to your research based over in UBC, obviously worldwide research and the collaborations that you have worldwide. And perhaps just starting with that, I mean, what is your big research platform that you're involved with? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your work.
Sure. So I have a Canada Research Chair position that sounds kind of lofty, but it kind of encompasses what I do. So I'm a Canada Research Chair in Landscapes of Climate Change. And what that actually means is I study how landscapes are responding to changes in climate, and particularly how glaciated landscapes are. So my initial passion was glaciers and how they shape and reshape mountains and landscapes, and how that is changing as glaciers are responding to climate change, to changes in, regional warming and changes in snow and rain. But what those effects are beyond the glacier, so how the glaciers transform landscapes and how people have been responding to that transformation. So I sit in the geography department at UBC, and geography is the discipline. It's really interdisciplinary, and it's really the understanding of contemporary human environment relationships. And it's our, I'm on the physical geography side, which is predominantly thinking about how do we understand the environment, and how do we either quantify or process the changes, but also what does that mean for society? What does that mean for ecosystems? And so I take a bit of a critical approach to that and think about how do we know about landscapes? Like how do we understand these cascading effects of climate change? How do we understand them in terms of how the environment is actually shifting, how nature is shifting, but also how culture is shifting, how humans are adapting or maladapting to these changes. So my research program kind of covers all of that. And the beauty of it is that because I'm interested in glaciers and glaciated landscapes, I've had the wonderful opportunity to go and study them in many different places. So I do research in the Indian Himalaya. I do research on the Greenland ice sheet that's behind me right here. In the BC coast mountains and the coast mountains of Alaska, in the Tian Shan in the high mountain Asia, and in the Patagonian Andes. And in each one of these places, what we're really interested in is kind of capturing ongoing impacts of climate change on ice masses, but then also how those ice masses are increasing or transforming the amount of fresh water that's delivered downstream, and also the amount of sediment and nutrients that are delivered downstream.
Exactly. Gosh, so I mean, so we've all heard of peak oil. So you're starting to think about this tipping point that may exist with regards to the fresh water that's held in these glaciers. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the health of glaciers and how potentially this tipping point may be reached or has been reached? I mean, where are we at in the different
So,
around the world?
you know, it's hard to envision it as a tipping point. So just to put this in context, right? Of all the water on Earth, only 3% of it or less is fresh water. And that fresh water is the lifeblood of the Earth system. It's also, it's life. It's the lifeblood of our biosphere, of humanity. And of that less than 3% fresh water on Earth, 99% of it is held in glaciers and ice sheets. So they're like the storage tanks. They're the water towers. And almost everywhere on Earth, these water towers are dwindling, they're shrinking. Where there's a tipping point, though, varies depending upon where you are. So, for instance, you know, in the coast mountains, we're seeing glaciers that are shrinking dramatically, and there are, you know, there are particular places and mountaintops in the coast mountains where the ice will be gone by 2100 or even sooner than that. If we think about Antarctica, or, you know, Antarctica has 3 ice sheets melded together, but if we even think of the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the smallest of the ice sheets, there's still plenty there. That's losing water too, but there's still plenty of ice there. So it's sustained for the long run. So we do consider these tipping points, but the tipping points are place-based. They're regionally specific. And we can think of them, you mentioned peak oil, we can think of them as peak water. So what happens as glaciers shrink, so they're the water towers, they're the storage tanks. And if you pull the drain of the storage tank or you shrink the storage tank, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to get an increase in water downstream, right? So it's draining faster. So in some parts of the world, like in BC and in Patagonia, where I work as well, what we're seeing right now is an increase in the amount of water. But over time, that storage tank is shrinking, so it's not going to be holding as much. So at some point, you kind of pass that peak water and you get less fresh water out of the system every year. And it's those changes that are what people and ecosystems are adapting to. So with peak water is, you know, overall, we're getting more in the beginning, getting more water and then having less. So if you're interested in hydropower, that's important. You need to know you have to have a 50 or 100-year horizon on what the changes are. What's also happening is as your storage tank shrinks and there's less snow in the winter, your storage tank gets a little more fluctuating. So we are seeing more variable discharge in the rivers downstream. And why I say all this is because we're interested in using that water. We use that water for agriculture. We use it for hydropower. We live along the banks of these rivers. And when the amount of water coming out of the water towers changes, it has dramatic impacts on land use, on resources, on hazards. And as the water gets more variable, it means that we're seeing floods that are happening more frequently. They're happening earlier in the season, and there's not enough water later in the season, in the late summer, for instance, our indicator species like salmon, because they need that cold, fresh water from the glaciers to sustain their habitats. And so all of these are what I call cascading impacts of climate change. So the glaciers are going through this kind of tipping point, and it isn't just a threshold, but it has all these other impacts on all these other parts of the ecosystem.
Right. And then how about the sort of more sudden impacts, the more and can probably connect, as you'll probably explain, connected to climate change, that when glaciers are impacted by climate change and cause sort of catastrophic events, whether it's recently perhaps about Butte Inlet here on the BC coast, or in India, the base of the Himalayas there, these events going to be happening more often? I mean, what sort of connections do you see to these events and climate change?
That's another one of these big cascading impacts. So you can think about these glaciers. They're not just water towers. They also they kind of hold the mountains in place. And as they're shrinking and they're losing mass, what they're doing is actually exposing the walls, the valley walls around them. They're exposing kind of loose, unconsolidated materials, and they're shrinking because the temperatures are warming, and the temperatures are not only influencing the glaciers, they're also influencing the permafrost that exists in the mountains as well. And the third thing that happens is, as these glaciers pull back, they oftentimes there will be a moraine, and then there will be a lake that forms at the toe, and the lake starts to grow. So all of these can fail catastrophically. And we've seen that. So that's what happened in Butte Inlet a month or two ago. And then that was a lake outburst flood that came down a creek. And there can be these massive flood events that happen, and a landslides can happen that then turn into a flood, or if they enter a body of water, they cause a tsunami. There was a massive event that happened in Southeast Alaska in 2015 that we were tracking, where there was a tsunami that sent a wall of water that was 192 meters tall down a fjord. So the community has been tracking these, and the most recent one happened last month. That was in Chamoli in the Garhwal Himalaya. And I've been part of a group that's been kind of monitoring what happened, which was an ice rock avalanche that slid down the mountain, but then it turned into a debris flow, which turned into a flood, which took out 2 hydropower dams. And there's a number of people still missing, and many who perished, and these hazards are ongoing. So we're keeping track of that. And all of this, so there's a lot of people who are looking at these phenomena, and we all are intuiting that they're becoming more frequent, and they're having a larger magnitude, like a larger hazard, a larger disaster, and that we're living in this time of climate change, and these two must be related in some way. And there's still a lot of resistance in the science community to create a causal link between the two. But intuitively, we know that this is happening.
Right. So any sort of early warning system, is anything that can be developed to actually sort of try?
Yeah, and so that's a lot of what we're working on now, what the community is working on, and that's bringing together, they're actually disparate scientific communities, one looking at natural hazards and one looking at cryospheric hazards, or hazards in the cryosphere. The cryosphere is the icy realms, so glaciers, permafrost, sea ice, and starting to think about, like, how do we actually develop an early warning system?
Yeah.
And how do we work with communities to understand how they might, what would a warning system, an effective warning system be? What are the possibilities of adaptation or mitigation for these kinds of hazards? And so a lot of that work, we're doing some of that work in the Garhwal Himalaya right now, trying to figure out how to respond to a recent disaster and what may happen in the future, but there's a lot of places that we haven't even been monitoring. So we can't categorize necessarily what the hazard is yet. So it's starting to figure out, what are the major drivers? Is it places that are warming more? Is it places that have steep slopes where the glaciers are receding more? In Alaska, we see that a lot of these hazards happen when we have these atmospheric rivers. The Pineapple Express is a very warm, wet winter time, and we've seen an increase in the amount of landslides that happen during that time. There was one that happened over the town of Haines in December. And so figuring out, how do we actually build a warning system that can take into account all of these changes, so that if we know that there's going to be a climate phenomena like an atmospheric river coming in, what should we be looking for? Where should we be looking?
Sure. And how about engaging with the communities, the local communities in these areas, and the knowledge that they have, either historical knowledge or just the way of life? I mean, what are they noticing? What are your connections there?
Exactly. So what's really interesting is when we have just started to reach out to communities, and this is a big shift in the way we think about the usefulness of science, or the usefulness of understanding this, is to actually have the communities help us in defining where we should be looking, the research that should be doing, and then co-producing, or working together to figure out, how do we monitor for these. So there are communities, for instance, some of the communities that we work with in Southeast Alaska, where there are individuals that have, multiple generations of knowledge and experience, and have awareness of these types of hazards, was this landslides and tsunamis, for instance. And it's starting to have that conversation and building that kind of, it's a bad word, but we're building a database that kind of understands, that can incorporate individual experience that previously was deemed anecdotal, right? Yeah. And that it's actually a very important piece of evidence. These are critical observations to be made.
Yes.
And the other place of working with the communities is really thinking through, well, what is the purpose of actually producing this knowledge? Like, what could they actually do with it, right? So, for instance, the work that we were doing in Alaska came out of the observation that was made that there was a slope that looked like it could fail near the terminus of a glacier. This is in Barry Arm, Alaska. In Harriman Fjord. And there's a town near there called Whittier. And in the initial response to noticing and kind of highlighting to the state and federal agencies that there's a potential that there could be a massive landslide and it could cause a tsunami, the community was like, well, but what could we do about that? Like, producing fear of the potential or the unknown is not necessarily it's not necessarily beneficial. So it's actually working with communities to come up with to build trust, to build two-way communication, so that we can take in various forms of observation and understanding as it comes by, but also figuring out what are adaptation strategies that make sense given people's livelihoods, given the way, the hazards that they're already contending with and living with.
Yeah.
So, for instance, Whittier is a predominantly fishing community. And the fishermen are like, well, you know, one of the safest places to be in a tsunami is to be out in the middle of the bay on your boat, as opposed to being on the shoreline. So how do we actually work that into our monitoring strategy? Or yeah. So
no. Well, let's take it. So let's think back to the Butte Inlet incident, and that's obviously a little bit closer to home. Should people on the BC coast be worried about potential incidents that could happen here? I mean, should there be more things that the government should be doing, whether I'm getting involved in the work that you're doing or being informed by the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one thing that there are several of my colleagues that actually are from BC that are involved in this work that we're doing in Alaska right now, mainly because in Alaska, the state agencies and the federal government has kind of refocused their attention on the possibilities of these occurring. But the same thing holds true in BC. In BC, we saw it in Butte Inlet, in Elliott Creek, and there are many communities that live along the coast that are feeling the impacts of these changing hazards. They're also feeling the impacts of the changing of peak water and the changes that are happening to the glaciers upstream, and what does that mean for both water resources and sediment and nutrients moving through the rivers. And we're just starting to pay attention to these types of changes. And there's definitely, these hazards exist for BC communities as well, particularly those on the coast. And so starting to do that work of really engaging with the communities and the various stakeholders, engaging with provincial and federal agencies that, you know, figuring out what does that actually mean for these communities.
Yeah,
for sure.
So we did have a question that came in with regards to the Site C dam and obviously the news that it is going to completion now, and whether you've got any sense that glacial melt could affect the hydroelectric projects along the Peace River there, namely the Site C dam. Do you have any?
Yeah, I don't have too much expertise and knowledge about what is happening to the glaciers upstream of Site C. But we have been doing work. So part of the interest and part of what's funded some of my work to understand how these glaciers are responding and what does that mean for water downstream has been through BC Hydro. And they're really interested in what does this mean for not only timing of water, so moving through the system and trying to plan for that out. As I mentioned before, you know, BC Hydro needs to plan. If you're going to build a reservoir, if you're going to build a dam, you have to have a 100-year plan, right? You have to have some idea of what capacity will need to be moving forward. And we don't have a solid sense of that yet for Site C and the Peace. We have a better sense of that for instance, I work at Bridge Glacier, which is in the Lillooet ice field, and much further south, closer to us. And that is the third largest hydro dam in BC Hydro's area. So they're very interested in kind of what does that mean in terms of how much water will we get? When will we get it? How can we move that water downstream? But also another thing to consider is as these glaciers are shrinking, they're becoming more erosive. They can do more work. And so they're actually producing more sediment. And that sediment has the capacity to infill these reservoirs as well, right? So it travels downstream and then it collects in these reservoirs. And so how do we actually accommodate for that? And I don't think that has been addressed nearly substantially enough for Site C, but mainly for all of our reservoirs.
Sure. And in the ecology of the rivers as well. I mean, how obviously with the catastrophic event, namely Butte Inlet, obviously the salmon run that this year is going to be, well, anticipated as being quite devastated.
Yeah.
But is there sort of ongoing sort of change of ecology that's all of the systems, that river systems, that's also
yeah, absolutely. We've seen that in a lot of the watersheds up and down the coast. As I said before, like the salmon they can be devastated by a single large event, but they can also be devastated by these slow incremental changes in terms of the water temperature and the clarity of the water, right? The turbidity of the water also affects their spawning grounds. And so what we're seeing is, and we're working with some of our First Nations collaborators who have, we describe it as like, oh, well, we have a chum run and we have a chinook run. And they have identified that there's many more subspecies and subcomponents to these. There's a difference between the spring chum and the fall chum runs, and they're affected in different ways by these changes in the water temperature, changes in the sediment and nutrient content of the water that's affecting these runs over the long term. And so we're seeing impacts on eulachon, and we're seeing impacts on salmon in much of the rivers up and down the Pacific Northwest, and what we call Salmon Nation, in this whole bioregion here, that are affected by these shifts.
Right. So the actual glacial melting of these glaciers, is air pollution a factor in the glacier melt? Are you seeing that impact, or air pollution, perhaps black carbon in particular, as an example?
Yeah, absolutely. So less so here,
right,
in BC, but for instance, in places like the Himalaya or the Tian Shan, where downstream, where they have very strong monsoon, so there's very strong transport of air pollution and black carbon and brown carbon, sorry, from the lowlands to up onto the glaciers that are actually affecting the melt rate. So what happens is, you think about a glacier with new snow on it with no impurities in it or no black carbon in it, has a very high albedo, right? It reflects a lot. It's very white. It reflects a lot of the energy back to space. If you decrease the albedo, if you add more dirtiness onto it, then the albedo decreases. So it's actually absorbing more of the heat, reflecting and not reflecting it back, which is a nonlinear feedback to how the glaciers melt, right? So they're balance. So in high mountain Asia, this is a huge thing.
Yeah,
where there's massive influx of black carbon and brown carbon that have been advected onto the ice, and that's impacting the melt rates of glaciers.
Right.
We see a little less of it here, although one thing that I would point out is when we get these massive dust storms, such as what's coming over from the Gobi Desert and Inner Mongolia, and the air pollution in Beijing right now, unbelievable. We can see that being migrating across the Pacific, and then it gets accumulated onto the glaciers in the coast mountains, and we actually can see those layers of fluid and dust accumulation on there, and that has an impact on mass balance and the melting of the glaciers here.
How about forest fires here in BC?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So we see a lot of just starting to do the kind of the correlative work between wildfires and black carbon accumulation here. Mainly it's been done looking at snow melt and snow hydrology, and less so for the glaciers, but it's the same phenomena.
So is this obviously the continued retreat of glaciers? Is this just inevitable now? I mean, I think of postcards that we've all seen of, you know, someone standing next to a glacier in 1930, and then, you know, 50 years later, it's like, okay, where's the glacier gone? And is this just the trend and the pattern that we're going to continue seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've reached these thresholds where there are a few places, you know, 30 years ago when I first, well, there's more than 30 years ago now, when I first started kind of studying contemporary glaciers, and I went down to Antarctica.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, it was controversial. You know, there were that some people were thinking, well, if the temperatures continue to warm, then we're going to see more melting, and we're going to be losing this ice. And some people were pointing out, well, you know, if temperatures warm, then the air masses can hold more moisture, and we can actually see more snowfall.
Right.
It turns out that it's not just a one-to-one. So the melting of, warming of air temperatures is also warming ocean temperatures. The oceans are doing a lot of work to remove ice masses where they come in contact with the ocean, where they're calving. So we're in this zone of kind of so many reinforcing feedbacks that I can't name one place on Earth anymore where the glaciers are actually gaining substantive mass. There are some that are surging, so that's a different phenomena where the end of the ice, the terminus of the ice, can advance.
Yes.
But they're not actually gaining mass to do that. They slide and they thin, and then they waste away and they go back.
Yeah.
So it's not actually a response like the glaciers are growing.
Right. So does sea level rise have a connection or an impact on the connections and the work that you're doing?
Well, so I mean, sea level rise has been the one dimension that people go to when they say, "Oh, well, we're losing the ice, and it's contributing to sea level rise." And what I keep pushing back on is, like, there's many more impacts than sea level rise. So, you know, if you're in Miami, you're focused on sea level rise, and that, you know, what's happening down at the poles might be affecting that. But there's many other components to it. Sea level rise, it also has a feedback on calving glaciers, where if the sea level gets if the water depth gets deeper, you can float the ice, and then if the ice can float, then you can kind of disintegrate the iceberg. The ice, have icebergs, armadas, and ice shelves disintegrating. That impact is not like sea level rise of 1 meter on a 500 meter deep ice cliff is not a massive risk, positive feedback, but it is a component of it.
Right.
Sure.
So a lot of your work, or another component of your work, has been outreach and actually sort of engaging people in your work and their awareness of the challenges that glaciers are facing. And I read just about the soundscape the installation that you in Vancouver before Christmas, and it was a sort of a soundtrack of climate change. Can you tell us more about that and sort of the projects you're involved in? Yeah,
so as I was saying, so it's one thing to kind of understand how glacier melt might have all these impacts on landscapes and livelihoods, but it's another thing to recognize how much water is life and how much our experiences are embodied by the landscape and the changes in the landscape. And so I've always been fascinated by sound and by the way in which we understand place and space beyond the visual. I know, when most people think about glaciers and climate change, and they think about there was that movie Extreme Ice, and it's all very like dramatic and visual, but there's so much of the way that we live in the world and engage in the world with our other senses that we don't give enough credit to. And those other senses are the ones that really that are embodying and immersing. And so a few years ago, I started a project collaborating with some composers and musicians to capture the rhythms of the water. We call it water rhythms. And they're soundscapes of the ice and the water and the sediment moving down the river from the source to the sink. So from the mountaintop to the ocean. And so we've been capturing the sounds. So we use hydrophones under the water and also environmental sounds, at the ambient environment above the water, to try to capture those to really listen deeply to what is happening in the world around us. And one part of that I find fascinating, so we've done a number of installations. We did one in Vancouver that was associated with the TED Countdown Conference. So it was a conference on climate change and kind of deciding what we could do to kind of get people energized to tackle this wicked problem. It was actually a two-part installation. One was, so these were sounds that we'd captured from glaciers and mountains in the Indian Himalaya, in Greenland, in BC. And we created these compositions where the sounds of the water and the ice and the people and the dogs that live close to the ice, close to the water, and kind of embody that water and that sediment that's coming from the glaciers as it's moving and traveling its way down. And one of the magical things that we discovered in this process is that if you listen to the water, particularly if it's turbulent, it has a lot of these air bubbles in it, or it's going over a waterfall, it has a tempo, it has a beat. And the tempos that you can hear in the water are the sweet spot of a lot of music that's played around the world. It's around 130 beats per minute. And it's also the tempo of our heartbeat at birth. So we're more intimately tied to the water and the soundscapes that the water produces than we even recognize. We're not only tied in terms of the materialness, we're also tied in terms of this embodiment. And one of the kind of exploring with this is looking at the musical traditions and the languages along the river too. So one of the things I noticed working in the Himalayas is when you're up in the upper Himalayas where there's lots of water and rocks tumbling down, it's all cacophonous. And the musical traditions and the languages spoken in the Himalayas also have a lot of that cacophony, lots of atonal and polyrhythmic. If you can imagine in your mind, like Tibetan monks chanting, there's banging and clashing, and the language has a lot of k and ch, and it's very evocative of the sounds that the water is making and the glaciers are making. And then as you follow that river, so let's follow the Ganges, for instance, right? The sacred Ganga River, and we follow it from the source and then down to the lowlands. And then when we get to the lowlands, the water gets more organized, it gets softer and gentler. The music becomes more lyrical and tonal. The rhythms become more organized and orderly. And the language becomes more lilting as well. And so one dimension that we're just starting to explore, but that's kind of part of my passion, is kind of understanding how, you know, these histories of our relationship to water and to the climate that creates this water are really intimately tied. They're bound to our culture, and they're bound to our language and our music and our spiritual traditions. And, you know, so to kind of track that evolution in space, but also in time, right? So we're following the water as a culture.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. No, beautiful. We're probably sort of coming towards the end of time, but I do have just a couple more questions. Just how did you find you mentioned at the beginning, but how did you find your way into the field of study? What really drew you to glaciers in particular?
Yeah, so I was so fortunate I grew up all over the world. I traveled with my family, and then we landed in Switzerland.
Oh,
and so
right.
I spent a lot of time in the mountains of Switzerland.
Yes.
Every summer, you know, my family was very much into hiking, so that's what we did.
Yes.
And we would go up there and we would just spend time in these majestic mountains. And so it kind of it became my spiritual home. Like, this is a place that I felt, it wasn't just aesthetically beautiful, it was soothing to be there and to be hiking along and in proximity to these, you know, slow moving rivers of ice that were carving these beautiful mountains. And so I was always attracted to that.
Yeah.
And then I discovered at university that I could get a degree and I could go and be in the mountains and study these places. And not only study the physical places in the mountains, but also to understand the people that lived in these places, and you know, people that kind of shared my appreciation of these spaces, of these beautiful places. And so that's what drew me to geography and drew me to studying glaciers. And then from Switzerland, I lived in Scotland and in New England in the US. And then I moved to the Pacific Northwest, and I realized that, like, this encompassed everything that fed my soul, right? To have mountains, to have ice, to have the ocean, to have water in all its forms, and to be able to live with that, and to be able to live and exist on the lands that have been stewarded by people who've lived with this space for thousands of years.
Yeah, no, we are so lucky. Gosh, wonderful. And if there's one takeaway for the viewers, what's the sort of bottom line? What would you like? Yeah, what message would you like viewers to take away from this conversation?
Well, I think that one of the takeaways that maybe I haven't highlighted thus far, but really where I really feel passionate about, is really understanding the history of place through the history of the people who've been in this place, and kind of appreciating how there are multiple perspectives and ways of knowing how we relate to our landscapes and places, and elevating and learning from those that have lived in these spaces. So as I mentioned before, the First Nations in BC have lived here for 16,000 years. They've lived here from before the time when there was an ice sheet that covered all of BC. And they have been resilient, and they've been relentless and adaptive to all the changes that have happened, not only of colonization, but before that, you know, that Mother Earth and nature threw at them. And they have a lot to teach us about resilience and adaptability, and just kind of and understanding our place and how we relate to, and how the things that we do, that nature is our kin, that the glaciers and the mountains are our kin, and they have agency, and they are teaching us something about how we're living unsustainably in the world.
Yeah.
And maybe we need to learn how to listen and we need to learn from the elders and our ancestors how to do that.
Gosh, yes, thank you very much, Michele. No, that's a wonderful note to end on, and yeah, just extend my thanks to you for spending time with us here at the Salt Spring Forum, sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and a very far-reaching conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.